In a small town in the state of Ohio, there stood an old, pale white wooden house. Its paint was peeling, the front fence leaned slightly, and a wind chime whispered softly whenever the morning breeze passed. Inside that house lived an elderly man named Walter Harris, 78 years old. Every morning, Walter woke before the sun fully rose, not because he was eager to start the day, but because silence always woke him. A silence too wide, a silence that felt heavy. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the side of the mattress that had been empty for years. He spoke softly, almost in a whisper. "Good morning, Mary," even though no one was there, only an old photograph on the small table, a woman with a warm smile and eyes that still seemed to look at him, his wife, his partner for 46 years. He always set up the small kitchen for 2 people, 2 cups, 2 plates. Then, as if realizing, he pulled one back and returned it to the cupboard. That small gesture became a small wound, repeated every single day. Walter used to be known as friendly. He was a school bus driver, always laughing, always with stories for the neighborhood kids. But since Mary passed away 3 years ago, Walter's world had shrunk from a small town to a small house and then to a single chair in the living room. In that chair, he sat for hours, staring out the window, watching people pass without truly seeing them. The television stayed on only to chase away the silence, not to be watched. The wall clock ticked too loudly, as if deliberately reminding him that time was still moving, even though his life felt like it had stopped. Sometimes Walter no longer asked, "What will I do today?" but instead, "Why did I wake up today?" And that question always hung in the air, never truly answered. In that house, once full of laughter and the smell of Mary's coffee, there was now only one sound, the breathing of an old man trying to learn how to live alone in a world that felt far too quiet. Walter's days passed almost the same, too much the same, until one autumn morning when the air began to bite into the bones, something changed. Walter woke with shallow breaths and a heaviness in his chest. He sat on the edge of the bed longer than usual, waiting for the world to stop spinning. But the world did not stop. What slowed was his body, which now felt increasingly unfamiliar. He tried to stand. His knees trembled. His hand reached for the wall. For the first time, Walter felt afraid of his own body. In the kitchen, the kettle slipped from his hand. Hot water splashed across the floor. Walter just stood there, frozen, staring at the small mess, as if he were staring at his own life beginning to fall apart. He finally sat on the floor, not because he wanted to, but because his body could no longer support him. His breathing was shallow, his chest rose and fell rapidly, and the most frightening part, there was no voice calling his name. No Mary, no one saying, "Walter, are you okay?" No hurried footsteps from the other room, only the cold floor and the indifferent ticking of the clock. After several minutes that felt like hours, he managed to stand, but something inside him had cracked. Not a bone, not an object, but his belief that he could still take care of himself. From that day on, small things began to feel like mountains. Carrying groceries felt like lifting stones, stairs like tall walls, and night became his greatest enemy. Because at night, pain was louder, silence screamed more clearly, and Mary's shadow came more often, sitting across from him, smiling where he could no longer reach her. Walter began leaving voice messages on his own phone, just to hear a human voice, just to convince himself that he still existed. But deep in his heart, a fear slowly grew, like creeping cold. What if one day I fall, and no one knows? Autumn slowly turned into winter. Leaves vanished from the trees, and the world outside Walter's house became gray and empty. Inside, the silence grew heavier. Walter rarely left the house, not because he didn't want to, but because every step felt like a gamble. Slightly slippery sidewalks, winds that made him unsteady. A world that once felt familiar now seemed dangerous. He stopped going to Sunday church, stopped sitting on the park bench, stopped buying coffee at the little shop at the end of the street where the barista used to call his name. And when human voices disappeared from his days, his thoughts began to speak louder. Walter often woke in the middle of the night, certain he heard Mary calling him. He would shuffle to the living room, only to find an empty chair and darkness. The medications on the small table kept increasing, tiny labels with complicated words. He often forgot whether he had taken them or not. Sometimes he didn't care. One afternoon, Walter received a letter from the hospital, a reminder for a medical checkup he had missed twice. He placed the envelope near Mary's photo and let it collect dust. "What for?" he murmured. "No one is waiting for me to come home." He began turning on fewer lights at night, saving electricity, he said. But in truth, he no longer cared whether the house was bright or dark. Everything felt the same. His body weakened, his world narrowed, and his heart, slowly, like an abandoned room, began to grow cold. Without realizing it, Walter had not only lost Mary, he was beginning to lose himself. One night, in the middle of winter, the power in Walter's neighborhood went out. No lights, no television, no sound except the wind striking the windows and the soft creaking of the wooden house. Walter sat in his living room chair with a thin blanket over his shoulders. His breath was visible in the cold air. He called Mary's name, not loudly, but desperately. He tried to stand to get a candle from the kitchen, but after only 2 steps, his legs gave out. His body hit the floor with a dull, lonely sound. Pain spread through his hip and back, but more painful was the reality that he couldn't get up. His hands trembled, clawing at the floor, but his body would not obey. Walter lay on the dark floor, staring at a ceiling he could not see. No clock, no light, no human voice, only his own breathing, growing uneven. There, on that cold floor, for the first time he did not just feel lonely, he felt like he was disappearing. Tears slid into his temples, into his thinning hair. He did not cry loudly. His crying was like a small leak, soft, constant, and with no one to fix it. "I'm tired, Mary," he whispered. "I don't know how to live without you." Hours passed, or maybe minutes, Walter didn't know. Time lost its meaning when there was no one to measure it with. His body grew colder, and between pain and drowsiness, a terrifying thought appeared. Maybe this was the end, not in a hospital, not surrounded by people, but on the floor of his own home, alone. As Walter's consciousness drifted in and out like small waves, a foreign sound broke the silence. Not Mary's voice, not one from inside his head. A knock, soft, hesitant, followed by a woman's voice. "Mr. Harris, are you home?" Walter wanted to answer, but only a weak breath escaped. The knocking stopped, then came again, louder, more worried. Seconds later, the sound of keys and the door opening. A flashlight beam danced across the walls, then landed on his body on the floor. "Oh my God!" the voice trembled. It was Emily, his young neighbor. She had moved in 6 months earlier. She noticed the uncollected newspapers, the Fulham mailbox, the lights that never turned on. Something inside her said, "Check on him." An ambulance arrived. Red and blue lights reflected off the walls of the old house. Walter was lifted onto a stretcher, covered with a blanket, oxygen on his face. Inside the trembling vehicle, Walter stared at the white ceiling. For the first time in a long while, he heard human voices around him. Between the sounds of medical equipment and the paramedics' radio, a realization slowly formed. He had almost gone without anyone knowing. New tears came, not only from pain, but because he realized he did not want to disappear like that. In the emergency room, under lights that were too bright, Walter closed his eyes and took a long breath. And in that breath, for the first time, there was something other than grief, a small desire to stay. Walter did not become okay right away. Recovery did not arrive like a light switch. It came like a winter morning, slow, cold, and taking time to be felt. He spent several days in the hospital. No broken bones, but a body worn down. The doctors spoke about blood pressure, balance, and living alone at an advanced age. Words he had avoided, now he had to hear. Emily came to visit, awkward, carrying soup in a small thermos. They didn't talk much, but her presence made the room feel occupied. When Walter returned home, the house was no longer quite the same. There were new handrails in the bathroom, a small chair in the hallway, a weekly nurse visit scheduled. And the hardest part, there were now human voices occasionally entering those silent rooms. Walter began sitting on the porch every morning. At first, only 5 minutes, letting the sun touch his hands, letting the world see him. Emily sometimes waved from across the street. The mailman started greeting him again. Small things, but small things are the beginning of big ones. One afternoon, Walter cleared the small table and put 1 cup back into the cupboard, not because he forgot, but because he was learning that 1 does not always mean empty. He still spoke to Mary's photo, but now, sometimes, he also spoke to living people, and that was a heavy step, but a real one. Winter passed. Snow melted along the sidewalks. Grass began to show its pale green. And on the porch of that old wooden house, Walter sat with a thin blanket and a warm cup of coffee in his hands. His breath was still shallow, his steps still slow. Mary still often lived in his thoughts. But now, among all of that, there was space. One morning, Emily sat on the porch steps beside him. They didn't talk about big things, just the weather, the birds, the smell of bread from across the street. But Walter chuckled softly, and he realized it had been a very long time since he last laughed. Inside the house, Mary's photo was still in its place. He never moved it. Loss does not heal, it only changes shape. Walter now understood. Loneliness does not always disappear, but it can be accompanied. He was no longer a man waiting for the day to end. He was a man slowly, gently opening his days. And when evening came and the wind chimes sang on his porch, Walter closed his eyes and whispered, "I'm still here, Mary, and I will try one more day." Because sometimes the greatest courage in old age is not forgetting, but staying, even when the house feels far too quiet.